What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the revamped version of What If Deku Had Microbots. In this video, we're going to cover the life of a genius Izuku Midoriya, so strap in, get a snack, and if you enjoy the video, leave a like to make your boy's day. That said, enjoy.
Hey Ross, sauce it up.
We start our story off with the birth of Tadashi Midoriya. A young Inko and Hisashi would have ended up having Izuku's big brother. I'm pretty sure as soon as you guys heard that, y'all were like, oh yeah, Xehther, what are you doing? But trust, I got it. Put your faith in me. I got it. Anyways though, Deku would shortly be born after a couple of years later, and he'd be quirkless. However, Deku is extremely smart to the point where he might as well have been born with an IQ boosting like quirk. And his brother, Tadashi, would have been born inheriting their father's quirk. He always would have been raised as the favorite, and Tadashi would have been pretty much known to be a future pro hero. He wanted to be a hero after all. That's all he ever wanted, right? And pretty much what would end up happening is that Deku growing up would want to become a hero because of All Might, because of his brother, and you know, he sees he's going to become a hero. And so Deku would end up kind of just chilling, you know what I mean? Like everything is going okay until eventually he's 4 years old. What's my quirk? They tell him he's quirkless. All this time everybody thought Izuku just had some sort of intelligence quirk, but apparently not. Izuku would just go on and tell people that his quirk was an IQ quirk or something like that. And everybody would kind of just accept Deku into their circle, leading him to hanging out with Bakugo and the bad crowd that Bakugo would associate himself with. Eventually, a couple of years would pass, and finally, one day would come around where Tadashi doesn't come home. A fire would have ensued, and Tadashi, wanting to be a hero during a villain attack, which was going on, which was the reason for the fire, Tadashi would have jumped in trying to save somebody. However, the villain would have ended up grabbing a car Marvel style, throwing it straight at the hero, missing, and then it would hit Tadashi, crush him, and Tadashi he gets splattered like a bug, like that annoying mosquito that we usually just GG, you know what I mean? And Tadashi's just he's dead. Following this, the police ends up arriving, and then the family of Tadashi would end up having to come and see if that is in fact Tadashi Midoriya, and it would be. Deku loses his brother, and for a while, Izuku would just be feeling terrible. I mean, how are you supposed to feel when your brother died? Your older brother, not your little brother, your older brother, like the guy who you looked up to all your life. You thought that he was indestructible. You thought that he was awesome. Like it's your big bro, you know, like he's not supposed to die. Not this soon, but he did. And Deku would fall into a bit of a depression-like state when eventually one day, after he had pretty much given up on the idea of becoming a hero, considering he was quirkless, he would see a note. And he realizes that he needs to do better. Grabbing the note, he would read it, and it would say, "Hey Deku, I don't know when I was gonna give this to you, but if you're reading it, it probably means I gave it to you. Look, in my heart, I know that just because you were told that you have no quirk, you probably gave up on wanting to be a hero. But Izuku, if anybody could do it and be a quirkless hero, it's you. You have an incredible mind. Everything about you screams extraordinary. Everything about you screams amazing. Everything about you screams one of a kind. Me, have a fire quirk. How many fire quirk heroes are there out there? Yeah, sure, I might become a hero someday, but you have potential to not only become the first quirkless hero, but to maybe become the #1 hero. I know you could do it, Izuku. Make me proud. Do it. Not just for you, but for every other quirkless person in the world. Let them know that you all could be heroes. Quirkless people alike. We could all do it together, you know? And Izuku would just be tearing up, like tears would come in and they would not stop pouring. I'm talking tears on tears on tears on tears. And Izuku was just having a very emotional moment, to say the least. Eventually, however, what would pretty much end up happening is that we would get towards the final day of class. Izuku would be sitting there and it would be the following day after he had read that note. Izuku from here would just think to himself that he needs to change. So with that sad air around him finally gone, Izuku, while Bakugo would have gone up to him and tried to be like, hey, we're gonna go here, Izuku just stays silent and just walks home. Bakugo would be like, hey, why you ignoring me, Deku? And then Deku would just stay silent, just looking forward. Bakugo would be like, whatever, talk to that nerd tomorrow. Until eventually, Deku would make his way towards a weird little alleyway, right? And underneath it, he would eventually end up getting attacked by the sludge villain just like he would in the original. Eventually, what would pretty much end up happening is that All Might would end up arriving, and with All Might arriving, Deku would be saved, and then eventually he would ask All Might if he could potentially become a hero. All Might stops for a second, thinks about the question, and says, no, you can't become a hero. Not without a quirk. This business is far too dangerous for anybody without one. So no. You can help in other ways. A policeman, firefighter, FBI. There's a bunch of options. Maybe even a support hero or something like that. But you can't be, as a support gear person, but you can't be a hero. And Izuku's dreams would feel like they're crushed, but it would almost be as though Tadashi in his mind had told him not to give up. And Izuku would steel his resolve even further, beginning to make his walk home. All Might would end up walking away, and eventually, Izuku would end up noticing an explosion. Running towards it to write some notes down on what's going down, Izuku makes his way over there when suddenly he sees Bakugo. Eventually, Bakugo looks at him and eyes that Izuku would see would be eyes of somebody that's screaming for help. Izuku would immediately rush over towards Bakugo and would immediately grab his backpack, throwing his pencil directly at the direction of the sludge villain, grabbing onto Bakugo's arm and trying to save him, wanting to do the right thing, but he can't. The sludge villain would be just about to take him out completely when suddenly All Might jumps in, saving his life, eventually leading to Izuku getting scolded by the media and Bakugo being berated with questions, told that he's great, how did you survive this long, what's your quirk, yada yada yada. Eventually Izuku would begin his walk home, and suddenly it would be at this moment that a big man would end up arriving. A big black man. Nah, but for real though, Deku would end up seeing All Might arrive, and All Might would be like, young Midoriya, you can't become a hero. Suddenly, All Might would then tell Izuku that with his quirk, Deku would stop him right there and be like, look, whatever you're gonna tell me, I don't want to know. It's cool that you're telling me now that I can become a hero. And it's cool that you saved my life. Thank you. But you told me no. And now you're gonna hold down that word. That phrase that you said only a couple of minutes ago, when you told me that I couldn't become a hero, All Might, get ready to choke on those words. Because trust me, I'm gonna be the first quirkless hero ever. And I promise you one thing, I'm gonna be number one as well. So make sure you watch yourself, because I'm coming for that spot. As he would leave the area, and All Might would just stay silent. After this, Deku would decide that what he's going to be doing is creating a support item for himself that would make it so that he could keep up with quirk people. And so, over the 10 months, Deku would not only end up creating the microbots, but he would also train on his body, using his intellect, research that he would do online to eventually complete the same amount of training that he would have done over the 10 months with All Might, and even less time. And because he's so smart, he did the quickest and fastest way to get ripped. So he would be around that Bakugo body type shape by the time that the 10 months would be over, and would be more than prepared for the entrance exam. During said entrance exam, Izuku, knowing that he should probably do something ahead of time, would end up actually asking for permission to use his, asking for permission to use his microbots during the exam, considering that he is quirkless. And he would be allowed to, considering that, he's quirkless. He needs to have some way to beat these robots. So Deku would be allowed. And ultimately what would pretty much end up happening is that Deku would ace the written exam. He wouldn't be mumbling this time around, considering that his personality is a bit different. And instead, he would just kind of stay quiet. Eventually, however, we would make it to the portion where they're all outside and they would all be waiting for the gates to open, when suddenly Deku, wanting to make his way more towards the front, would then immediately get stopped by a boy with blue hair. Ida, of course, being the goody two-shoes he is, would have told Deku that he needs to leave that girl alone. And Deku would be like, huh? What are you talking about, dude? What girl? And Ida would say, don't play dumb with me. I know you were trying to go ruin that girl's chances. And Deku would say, dude, I just want to go to the front. As Ida would be like, my apologies. And Deku would be like, sheesh. As he makes his way towards the front, and eventually Deku would finally hear that the gates would be open, when President Mike begins to scream on and on about how they need to go and how there's no countdowns in a real battle. Deku would immediately, using his microbots, shoot himself up into the air and would pretty much end up riding them just like the villain in the Hero 6 movie would. Eventually, as soon as he sees one, he would shoot microbots in its direction, and the microbots themselves would be able to pretty much disarm the robot, pretty much taking it apart completely, leaving scrap metal behind. As Deku would do so, using his microbots, he would do this on many robots. And for others, he would create gigantic fists with his microbots, being able to use that to essentially destroy different kinds of robots over and over and over. And through watching this, Deku would think to himself that maybe a robot of some kind to help him out with his fights might not be a bad idea. So that idea would be in the back of his mind. But for now, the test would almost be about to be over when suddenly he would hear rumbling. Deku would look towards the direction of the sound, and it would be at this moment that he would see a gigantic robot coming in out of nowhere. Suddenly, looking over towards his right, he would see that a girl would be screaming. And Izuku, realizing what's going on, would immediately shoot a gigantic amount of microbots at the direction of the girl to create like a shield that would cover Uraraka, so that when inevitably the zero pointer went to go and step on it, the microbots would have spread all over the zero pointer and took it apart. Like literally took off each and every single one of the pieces. They unscrewed the bolts and everything, and the zero pointer would have just fallen back. Having lost one of its legs, it just falls back, and Uraraka would look up to see Izuku, who would be holding his hand out in front of her, asking her if she's okay, with a big grin on his face. She would take his hand and be like, yeah. And eventually the test would be marked over. Izuku from here would take Uraraka towards Recovery Girl, and it would be at this point that Izuku would end up pretty much getting 200 points. He would get 150 robot points easily, and he would end up getting the other 50 points from rescue points, which leads us to the next part that's going to be happening. And that is that Deku would wake up for his first day of UA. Considering 200 points, it's very hard not to pass. You'd have to be getting like a 0 on the written exam to not pass with 200 points. And even then, I'm pretty sure you would still be allowed to go into the hero course with extra academics on the side. However, considering the nature of this story, we're going to keep going, and everything is pretty much going to go much like you guys would expect. This time around, an extra character will be thrown into the story in replacement with Invisible Girl, that being Mei Hatsume. Now, I'm going to be saying that she's in the hero course as well because, I don't know, plot. And eventually what would pretty much end up happening on his first day of school is when Deku walks in, he would notice Bakugo and Ida arguing, and eventually he realizes that Mei Hatsume would have been standing right behind him. Before Uraraka could even go over towards Deku and thank him for saving her, Mei Hatsume would jump in the way and ask Izuku what in the world those robots were, and if he made them himself. Deku from here would immediately tell her that he did, and that big gigantic grin that Mei would have on her face would begin to ask him so many questions that Izuku would wonder how many questions in total she asked. Must have been about 100, he would think. When suddenly, a man inside of a yellow bag would end up coming out, groggily as ever, and tell them to throw these weird costumes on, as they need to be going outside for their apprehension exams. And eventually, Uraraka would finally speak up, saying that aren't they supposed to go to orientation? But The man would simply say that they don't have time for it, and eventually everybody would finally follow his orders. Once they would make their way outside, Aizawa would end up tossing the ball towards the direction of Deku, and Deku would then grab the ball and toss it, just like a normal person. Aizawa would tell him to go all out, use his quirk, and it would be at this moment that Deku would reveal it to everybody. I'm quirkless. I use support items to get as far as I have. And then Hatsume would say, I did too. As Aizawa would say, interesting. We've never had this kind of case at UA High. Considering that that's what you're going to be using on the field, that's what I'm going to allow you to use. Even though it's not a quirk, go ahead and grab your support items. You can go last. As suddenly, he would give everything to all of the other students, and the first one to go would be Bakugo, leading all of the rest of the students to get extremely excited and say, oh yeah, you know what I mean? Like, this is going to be so much fun. Leading Aizawa to be like, oh, y'all think it's going to be fun? Oh, I bet. And Aizawa would ultimately end up showing them that it is indeed not sweet around this place. But pretty much what would end up happening following Izuku getting his gear, Izuku would go on and crush each and every single one of the tests that Aizawa would have put into place for them. The microbots were very, very useful, and Mei Hatsume has so many support items already that would allow her, at least at the bare minimum, not to get last place. After this, Deku and Mei, following school being over, Deku and Mei would end up going off somewhere, and she would convince him to go into the support course to ask if maybe he can be allowed to go into that one as well. And so Deku would end up entering the support course Mei Hatsume, because she is not only a part of the hero course, but also the support course after school. And so what would pretty much end up happening is that Deku would meet a bunch of his classmates in the support course, and he would end up actually becoming very good friends with them, learning that they're all actually great guys and that a lot of the people in the support course have very interesting, intricate personalities. Eventually, Izuku, through his time being there and how intelligent he truly is, Deku would easily be allowed into it, and eventually Deku would take up after school and normal school, going into the support course, and he would invent multiple things. Eventually, with the help of Mei Hatsume, he would upgrade his microbots even further, and eventually what would end up happening is that after a couple of days would pass, the heroes versus villains thing would finally end up popping up. All Might, just like in the original, would bust into the classroom and be like, ha ha ha, I am here, coming into the room like a normal person. Before then, suddenly, everybody would go crazy. And eventually what would pretty much end up happening is that Izuku would just watch as All Might walks in, and he would remember how All Might saved them, as well as how All Might told him that he can't be a hero. And that's something that's always going to stay in All Might's mind. But for now, he's going to decide that best to just leave it alone. Eventually, though, after a bit of time, All Might would end up telling them all to pick some numbers from this bowl. And eventually he would tell them that the point of this is to see who they're going to be facing off against for the first test that they're going to be having in UA High, the hero course. And eventually, after picking everything, Deku would be paired up with Deku and Mei, right? However, they're going to be going up against Bakugo and Ida. And what would pretty much end up happening during this thing is I think that Bakugo wouldn't really be too enraged at Deku. However, he still wants to destroy his opponents. So he would jump in, and through the time that they would have in the building, Bakugo would eventually rush towards Deku, something that he expected from Bakugo, and Deku would immediately set off the trap that he would have created using his microbots. In the door would be a very, very thick layer of just like this substance. I can't really explain it. It's like a sticky substance that if you get shot into it, it's kind of like it's like sludge. It's like sludge. Deku realized the sludge villain was easily able to neutralize a lot of things. So if Deku has sludge on him, he could probably neutralize a lot of quirks, and it would work. Because the second that Bakugo would turn the corner, a gigantic amount of sludge would be launched at Bakugo, and Bakugo would be like, what is this? As he then turns towards the direction of Deku, and he would be like, you coward, how could you hide behind this? As Deku would say that he has brains while he has bronze, and that now he's about to show him why it's better to have both. As Deku would lunge in, and bam, bop Bakugo in the face, right? Bakugo would look back up, gritting his teeth as hard as he can. You could basically hear how hard Bakugo's doing it. And eventually what would pretty much end up happening is that Deku would end up using his microbots to tie up Bakugo, leading him to be completely eliminated from the match. Following this, Deku and Bakugo, no, not Deku and Bakugo, but Deku and Mei would end up going over towards Ida's direction, taking him out very easily using one of Mei's gadgets this time, and would easily end up copying the win. Leading us to after school with Deku and Mei just laughing and talking about how much fun it was to actually work together. They'd be at a coffee shop and Deku would say that he and her make a great team, and Mei would say they do. Now, in Deku's eyes, they were flirting, but in Mei's eyes, they were just talking because she has no time for that. I mean, she is in the hero course and the support course after all. No time for all this boyfriend stuff. She just got to make her babies. And Deku's thinking of making a different kind of baby. However, eventually what would end up happening is the stuff that would happen in normal canon, such as the situation where Ida becomes class president, and eventually we would skip over to the USJ event, where in this particular moment, Deku and Mei would be in the back of the bus sitting together, talking about what other inventions they could potentially make. Eventually, the class would talk about who the strongest people are in the classroom, and eventually Suyu would say that while Deku may not be strong in the normal way, Deku is so smart that he can't be counted out whatsoever, and everybody else would actually kind of agree. Eventually, however, they would make their way towards the USJ, and once they would end up arriving, the Hero 13 would end up greeting them all, and after Ida tells them all to get off of the bus, she goes on to give one of the most boring speeches in all of MHA. Eventually leading to Kurogiri arriving, teleporting in, and teleporting everybody else towards different locations. Deku, once he ends up arriving towards the location that he would be at, Deku, using the communicative headset that he has whenever he uses his microbots, would be able to easily call upon them, and eventually from the rooftop they would pour in like a tsunami. Deku, using his microbots, would end up shooting them into the water and the lake where all the villains would be at, and he would take each and every single one of them out easily, overpowering them and destroying them using the abilities of his microbots. It would be nothing. They would literally be decimated, and once Deku would be able to take them out, the first thing that Deku would think to do is to go save his other classmates. So Deku, using the abilities of the microbots, would end up flying up into the air, using them the same way that the main villain in Hero 6 would use them, and he would glide over towards the direction of Aizawa, using his microbots to grab onto one of the villains that was just about to actually attack Aizawa successfully, mind you, and Aizawa would thank Deku for that. As from here, Aizawa and Deku would both face off against all of these villains, multiple, right? And Deku would just use a bunch of different and cool maneuvers, forming a gigantic hand, a hammer, which would crush a bunch of villains. And eventually, after all this happens, Shigaraki would then end up grabbing at his neck and scratching it like nobody's business, right? Leading to Deku then looking at him and Shigaraki then saying, "Kurogiri, summon the Nomu." From here, Kurogiri would end up summoning the Nomu with his portal, and eventually the Nomu would end up shooting in, as it would punch at Deku so fast. Deku would have put up a barrier of microbots with a smirk on his face, thinking nothing would go through it, but the Nomu would have punched clean through it and sent Deku flying, breaking a rib and his arm, leading to then an Aizawa who would have actually also used his erasure quirk to get rid of its power. Deku would realize that that was just its brute strength, and Deku would be like coughing out blood at the fact that he's hurt so bad. From here, Aizawa would then get grabbed by the Nomu, and Aizawa would try his best to face off against it or fend it off, but he simply can't. Aizawa is a pro hero, but how many heroes do you guys think could take out a Nomu? Not a lot, at least not in early MHA. And so, once Aizawa pretty much gets bodied by the Nomu, Deku would slowly be getting up as he holds one hand up, and a gigantic tsunami of microbots would end up ensuing. Deku would look at the direction of Aizawa and tell him to get out of the way, as Aizawa would look towards the direction of Deku, blink once before realizing that things are about to get very, very serious. And Deku would be like, "Aizawa, get out of the way, as a gigantic storm of like microbots would shoot at the Nomu, and eventually it would swirl up into a gigantic tornado, as from the top would form a bunch of spikes, and they would be launched straight at the Nomu, leading the Nomu to get pierced in multiple directions, and eventually the Nomu would be on the ground. Suddenly, Zuko would let his guard down and let the microbots go away, when suddenly the Nomu would get back up, healing, as Shigaraki would basically monologue and tell everybody the powers of the Nomu. Deku, after hearing this, would say, "Thanks for the help, Shigaraki." Didn't even know, or no, not Shigaraki, but he'd be like, "Thanks for the help, villain. I had no idea what his weaknesses were. But now that I know that it's not even human, I can go all out, right?" So Deku would form a cocoon of microbots around the Nomu and would say, "This ends here. I'm taking you out." As from here, Shigaraki would say, "Try your best, hero."